Greetings to you as Christians from throughout the world observe the fifth Sunday of Lent. Lent is a season of penitence. It is a season during which we need to take time for self-reflection and introspection. We are preparing ourselves to celebrate the heart of our faith on Resurrection Sunday, new and resurrected life in Christ. As governments throughout the world scramble to slow the spread of the COVID-19 coronavirus, many nations in the world are going through some form of shutdown. In my own country, South Africa, we are in a national shutdown which allows only for essential service providers to still operate. And we've been told we have an initial period of 21 days. I suspect it could be longer. And so in one sense, how wonderful for those of us who can use this quieter time for renewal and reflection. My laptop has taught me an important lesson. If I simply walk away when I've been working and I do not put it onto sleep or shut it down, then when I come back, it does not operate optimally until eventually I realize, listen, the only thing you're going to be able to do right now is to close everything, shut down, and reboot. As human beings, we are meant to take regular times to reconnect with God and with ourselves and our community and our world in order to live life fully. In a world where busyness, productivity, and profit margins are often our top priorities, many of us never seem to find time for quiet and reflection. And so there is a sense where for some who can, this time is a gift from God. In God's grace, our lectionary readings, which are assigned to today, are just so apt for a time in which we find ourselves fighting off a potentially devastating pandemic. Our gospel reading contains the shortest verse in the Bible. Jesus wept. Jesus wept. And I have often pondered upon this verse and the picture it paints of Jesus weeping at the graveside of his friend Lazarus. I would suspect that his tears did not result, as some of the Jews in the crowds concluded, from his love for Lazarus and his loss of Lazarus. He was about to raise him from the dead after all. And so I ask, why do we then find Jesus weeping at this moment? And I suggest that Jesus wept out of empathy and in solidarity with Mary and Martha as they experienced the grief that accompanies the loss of a beloved friend and family relative. And he understood how easily, without the protection of a male relative, they could be marginalized in a patriarchal society. And so Jesus took their suffering upon himself in the same way that upon the cross he bore our pain and our suffering. And I want to suggest that today God weeps with those who have been most deeply affected by the coronavirus. He shares the grief of families who have lost one or more relatives. He shares the trauma of the doctors and the medical profession who are totally overwhelmed and overloaded and just feeling like they cannot make a difference because the load will not end. He feels with those who have always lived hand to mouth and will have no means of income during the shutdown period as they rely on crowds and crowded shopping centres and parking lots to earn their daily bread. He feels with those who are anxious and afraid. Declaring that our God is with us doesn't simply mean that he draws alongside of us. It speaks about the deep solidarity and sharing of our life that our God participates in through Christ. He is literally with us, sharing our suffering, as we as believers in Christ, as the Apostle Paul puts it, complete the sufferings of Christ through our own suffering. I also think perhaps that Jesus wept with Mary and Martha because they, along with other disciples at the time, couldn't fully understand his true identity or the implications of his life and his death. They were yet to witness his resurrection and to understand that we share in his resurrection life. They had not attained to the hope that is ours in Christ. So today I believe too that God weeps over some of our misunderstanding that surrounds the COVID-19 virus. Not everybody understands why we are trying to slow the rate of infection of a virus that so far has a relatively low mortality rate. They've not understood that we need to, as they say, flatten the curve so that the virus spread slows down and our medical facilities are able to offer hope and care to those who require drastic medical intervention. Some have still not really understood how it is that this virus spreads. And so sometimes I have seen people taking a protective measure and then I think feeling themselves to be immune to the virus and yet not taking the types of precautions that are vital for survival. And so I've seen people wearing gloves, touching every surface, not taking the gloves off or washing them, and then touching their hands to their faces. Not understanding that this virus doesn't come to us and enter our systems through the pores in our skin, but comes into our systems if we raise a hand or a gloved hand to our faces and breathe in the virus, or as we rub our eyes and it gets in through our eyes. I've watched people walking around with gloved hands and yet not observing the social distancing that we have been called to, and so standing close to one another, not realizing that the virus spreads through droplets if we cough or we sneeze. Some of our South African communities, sadly, there are some who think that this virus only spreads in certain sectors of our nation, and that as they don't belong to that sector, they don't have coronavirus where they are. And so they are not willing to practice social distancing or to go into a period of shutdown. And then we must add to the fear that travel bans and border closures has brought about, which has caused people to go panic shopping because they have thought that we will not have access to essential goods and services. And the result has been that some have stockpiled and others have not had access to whatever it is that they truly need. And so I'm sure Jesus weeps for the misunderstanding that for many simply increases the load that has already been brought to their lives through the coronavirus pandemic, and which is increasing the spread of the virus. But Lazarus's death is not the end of the story. We do not end with Jesus weeping at a grave. The story culminates in resurrection. It is this resurrection life that we live by and in as Christians. And so, as Paul says to us in his letter to the Romans, if the Spirit of him who raised Jesus from the dead lives in you, he will also give life to your mortal bodies through the Spirit who lives in you. Our Old Testament reading also actually speaks to us of death and hopelessness, and the living God breathing his Spirit and bringing newness and life to that which was considered lost. The bones that Ezekiel sees in the valley are not simply dry, they are very dry, and there is no longer any sign of life. These have been there for a long time. Humanly speaking, we have a picture of desolation, a picture without hope. But God brings newness and life, and flesh and sinews begin to arise, and the Spirit and the breath of God enters, and the corpses come to life. Ezekiel prophesied during the time when the people of Judah were in exile, and he makes the promise that after exile will be renewal and restoration. As we read this passage, I suppose we could look at the valley of dry bones and liken it to the potential aftermath of this pandemic. We can see this as a glimpse of the future in those places where the death toll has been very high. And we may see the coming to life of the new bones as God's promise that over a long period of time, slowly but surely, we are going to heal, just as Israel and the Israelites returned after 70 years. But I cannot help wondering if the picture of the dry bones is a picture of our world before coronavirus, COVID-19. A picture of a planet that was being destroyed as we exploited natural resources, as we increased carbon emissions into the atmosphere, as some held on to what God had provided at the expense of others, as we polluted our streams and our oceans and the air. Is it a picture of economic systems shaped in ways that continue to favor the rich and to further marginalize the poor? Is it a picture of lives which had become all about acquiring things and becoming successful? Is it a picture of individualism, the mindset, particularly in the Western world, that leaves to the haves just grabbing more and more at the expense of the have-nots? It is said that in places like China, as they are nearing the end of the ferocious spread of the virus, and where they have survived quarantines and lockdowns in order to slow the spread, new things are being discovered. Resurrection is being experienced. Throughout the world, many are becoming more aware of our need to pull together as Christians and communities and nations. Our political parties are for once actually putting the need to save the nation ahead of political gain and grabbing for power. People are discovering beauty in simplicity again, and how little we really need. We are finding new priorities. It is said that in Wuhan, the epicenter of the start of the virus, the song of the birds are heard again, and the air is clear and breathable. Potentially, we may learn new and more just ways in which to live together as humanity and as community. We may learn how to structure systems in ways that allow for the care of all of creation and all of God's created beings. And I believe God is working in the pandemic. Could it be that as God brought renewal to the people of Judah through a period of exile, we will see healing in our world through our experience as a world of COVID-19? Let me share some thoughts that were penned by a teacher in China after 7 weeks of lockdown, which he wrote to those who are preparing for their time inside, as he described it. And so he says, amongst other things, we're healthy, we're happy, we are humbled as we watch the rest of the world begin their time inside. The sense of our community I have felt during this time is incredible. I could choose who I wanted to spend my energy on, who to call, who to message, who to text. The quality of my relationships has improved immeasurably. You learn to appreciate the little things, like sunshine through the window or the flowers in the garden. The Apostle Paul writes in the same chapter that we go to and read from for the 5th Sunday of Lent, these words: we know that in all things God works for the good of those who love him, who have been called according to his purpose. Our God is a God of resurrection, a God of life. And even in the horror of pandemic, God will work to bring newness of life. And so, friends, in God we trust as we put our faith and our hope firmly in him at this time.